In early 1944, Japan thought it had found the key to stopping America's Pacific advance. Build vast island strongholds, fill them with steel bunkers, giant artillery, and thousands of troops, and wait for the U.S. to bleed itself dry, attacking them head-on. It was a strategy rooted in centuries of samurai doctrine. But the Americans weren't planning to attack. They were planning to go around. What followed at Kwajalein atoll was not just a crushing military victory. It shattered an entire military philosophy. For more forgotten World War II strategies like this, subscribe to No Man's Land. By 1944, the Empire of Japan believed it had finally calculated the one move that could stop the American advance. Not through mobility, but through sacrifice. Their entire strategy drew from centuries of samurai tradition. Turn every island into a fortress, every shoreline into a wall of fire, and force the enemy to pay for every inch in blood. They had studied Tarawa, a battle where over 1,000 Marines died storming a coral reef not even 1 mile wide. To them, this wasn't a tragedy. It was a blueprint. They envisioned repeating that horror on a scale so brutal, the United States would reconsider its Pacific campaign entirely. So they built on WWII, Mille, WWII, and dozens of other islands. Japanese engineers poured reinforced concrete into bunkers carved low to the ground. They mounted massive coastal guns aimed toward expected landing beaches. Thousands of troops were positioned in layered defensive grids with orders to fight to the last round, the last breath. These weren't temporary positions. They were intended to be permanent monuments to defiance. The islands were treated as if they were castles from feudal Japan, and the soldiers inside were reminded daily of the code: death with honor over retreat with shame. But beneath the confidence lay a fatal miscalculation. These defenses relied on one assumption: that America would fight the same war Japan prepared for, that they would arrive in rigid formation, frontal assaults, and predictable phases of bombardment. Japanese commanders believed American thinking was procedural and unimaginative, bound by military tradition rather than innovation. They expected the enemy to hammer the strongest points, not question why those points existed. Yet while the Japanese fortified the obvious, American strategists studied the gaps. They weren't planning to break the fortress. They were planning to make it irrelevant. What Japan viewed as unassailable strength was becoming the largest liability of the war. And with every concrete bunker they built, they unknowingly accelerated their own failure. The Americans weren't preparing to fight the fortress. They were preparing to ignore it. While Japan poured concrete and pride into its fortress islands, American intelligence quietly rewrote the playbook for how wars would be fought. By 1943, U.S. codebreakers at Station Haipo had already cracked key elements of Japanese naval encryption. Every reinforcement schedule, supply route, and defensive blueprint was feeding into American analysis. But what they discovered went beyond strategic positioning. It exposed a structural flaw in the entire Japanese doctrine. Behind the ring of heavily fortified islands sat Kwajalein Atoll, the administrative heartbeat of the Marshall Islands. It housed roughly 5,000 personnel, but only around 1,200 were trained combat troops. The rest were clerks, cooks, construction workers, and logistical staff. Japanese leadership assumed it was shielded by the outer fortresses. They believed no enemy would dare bypass them. To Nimitz, that wasn't protection. It was opportunity. In Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz gathered his inner command and studied the island clusters laid across the map. Generals pointed to the strongholds. Nimitz pointed to the center. Why strike strength, he asked, when weakness is exposed? His words flipped decades of conventional war strategy on its head. Instead of neutralizing the outer layer first, the U.S. would carve straight through the heart of the system, rendering the defensive ring meaningless. The gamble wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. No military in Japanese history had ever imagined that an enemy would ignore battle-hardened units and instead target support infrastructure. Even as Japan monitored American radio traffic, they failed to spot the shift in logic. They believed the bombing campaigns on outlying islands confirmed their expectation. Massive preparation before inevitable frontal assaults. But the Americans were only staging a performance. The real attack route had already been chosen, and no Japanese commander was looking in that direction. The decisive moment didn't come from artillery or airstrikes. It came from a question asked in silence over a map. And that question would end thousands of lives before a single American set foot on the beach. As 1943 turned into 1944, American battle groups advanced toward the Marshall Islands, but not with the intent Japan expected. Rather than preparing for a direct landing, U.S. forces began orchestrating a meticulously calculated deception. Aircraft carriers launched wave after wave of bombers, lighting up the skies above Jaluit, Mila, and Wotia. Naval artillery tore into airfields and coastal gun emplacements with relentless precision. To the defenders, this was the prelude to another Tarawa, intense softening of the target before bloody ground combat. Reconnaissance observers radioed reports back to Japanese command with confidence. The enemy prepares for invasion. Their doctrine seemed validated. Every explosion looked like proof the Americans were predictable, mechanical, just as expected. But the truth was far more dangerous. Those bombardments weren't designed to destroy the islands. They were designed to hold attention. Beneath the thunder of naval guns, U.S. intelligence confirmed that Japanese observation patterns were behaving exactly as predicted, focused outward toward the beaches they believed were the inevitable landing zones. Meanwhile, American transport fleets, shielded by weather and careful radio silence, maneuvered around the strongholds. Under camouflage discipline and night movement, they moved into position to bypass the defenses entirely. To make the deception believable, the Americans sustained the illusion for weeks. Engineers timed bomb drops to peak hours of observation, while naval gunners deliberately spread fire patterns to mimic invasion preparation. They even paused bombardments periodically, simulating troop staging cycles. Every lull encouraged Japanese forces to believe the landing would begin at dawn. It never came. On the islands, elite defenders sat inside bunkers, rehearsing countermeasures, unaware that U.S. planners had no intention of stepping foot on their beaches. They watched the skies burn, expecting death by invasion. Instead, death would come through irrelevance. While the Japanese braced to repel an army that wasn't coming, the real fleet sailed past their guns, straight into the lagoon at Kwajalein. What the Japanese believed was dominance was distraction. At sunrise on January 30th, 1944, Kwajalein atoll awoke to silence. The outer islands had endured weeks of shelling, but Kwajalein itself remained eerily calm. Most assumed the Americans were simply not ready to breach the outer defenses yet. Then, at approximately 7 a.m., Japanese spotters reported an anomaly. The horizon was changing shape. At first, they thought it was fog. Then the mist sharpened into lines, straight, towering, metallic lines. They were not clouds, they were warships. 7 U.S. battleships, 11 aircraft carriers, dozens of cruisers and destroyers, over 200 landing ships, and 40,000 American troops aboard transports, all moving as a single unstoppable body inside the lagoon. bypassing every gun Japan had aimed toward the sea. The invasion hadn't weakened the defensive ring. It had gone through it. Inside his command bunker, Admiral Manzo Akiyama stepped into the observation station and watched the impossible unfold. His artillery, positioned to fire outward, couldn't depress toward the interior lagoon. His strongest weapons faced the wrong direction. Before he could issue new instructions, 14-inch shells from USS New Mexico and USS Mississippi ripped through command posts, detonating munitions, collapsing bunkers, and severing communication lines. Headquarters fell into chaos. By 8 a.m., most Japanese field telephones were silent. Officers tried to redirect artillery toward the lagoon using manual repositioning, but the guns were too large, too fixed. Some even attempted to dig new emplacements under shell fire. It was futile. The enemy was not only at their doorstep, it was already inside the house. Akiyama, realizing the entire strategic model had failed in a single morning, wrote one final line in his field journal before blast shock threw him to the ground. "The enemy fights outside our imagination. The doctrine has failed." That sentence was more than an admission. It was a funeral notice for an era of warfare that could no longer survive on the battlefield. Elsewhere on the island, Japanese soldiers looked to the water and understood they were surrounded before the first American had even landed. Some reportedly cried, others prepared to die. But the battle had already been decided, before the first shot had been fired back. When the first American Marines hit the beaches of Kwajalein, the battle had already been won from above. Naval bombardment had transformed the island overnight. What once resembled a palm-covered atoll now looked like the surface of the moon. Trees were not splintered. They were gone. Defensive trenches split open like cracked stone. Bunkers meant to withstand hours of shelling were shattered in minutes by naval guns designed to punch through battleship armor. For many Japanese defenders, the hardest part wasn't holding the line. It was simply orienting themselves in a landscape that no longer existed. The Japanese resistance, though untrained and ill-equipped for heavy combat, fought with a level of desperation that shocked even hardened Marines. Clerks, cooks, radio operators, men who had been categorically deemed non-combat personnel days earlier, were handed rifles and told to hold positions against tanks and flamethrower teams. Eyewitnesses described defenders charging armored vehicles with bayonets, often in near-suicidal attempts to slow the advance. Some even emerged from wrecked bunkers carrying grenades in both hands, attempting last-ditch assaults that dissolved beneath withering machine gun fire. American armor moved inland with synchronized infantry support. Sherman tanks rolled through the pulverized terrain, often firing point-blank into pockets of resistance. Flamethrower units cleared concrete shelters one by one, turning strong points into tombs. Every step forward revealed more wreckage. Communications hubs reduced to tangled wires, radio stations silenced under crushed masonry, and administrative centers flattened into indistinguishable rubble. Within 96 hours, organized resistance had ceased. Roughly 8,500 Japanese personnel lay dead, either killed in combat or buried beneath collapsed structures. U.S. casualties totaled fewer than 400. Commanders didn't classify it as a standard military engagement. It was an elimination. But what made this battle uniquely devastating wasn't just its speed or casualty imbalance. It proved something far more consequential, that Japan's strongest positions could be destroyed without being confronted, and their central command nodes were vulnerable not to strength, but to imagination. Kwajalein was not just defeated, it was erased, and with it, the Pacific War strategy Japan had spent years building. While Kwajalein fell in just 4 days, the deeper devastation of the strategy came not from what the Americans destroyed, but from what they ignored. On the fortress islands of Kwajalein, Mila, and WWII, thousands of elite Japanese troops waited armed and ready, positioned within elaborate defensive networks designed to repel a frontal assault at any cost. Massive coastal guns stared tirelessly toward the ocean, their barrels aligned to intercept landing forces that would never arrive. The men occupying those positions believed they were preparing for the Empire's defining sacrifice. Instead, they would suffer a slow-motion defeat, not through combat, but through abandonment. As American warships bypassed the islands entirely, moving just beyond artillery range, Japanese soldiers watched supply convoys pass along routes they no longer controlled. Their firing solutions were useless. Their fortifications, once considered impenetrable, became obsolete overnight. There was no engagement to win. Instead, they were cut off, isolated, starved, and forgotten. With enemy transport routes now securely in American hands, no reinforcements or supplies could reach them, and no extraction order would come. Within weeks, the reality began to sink in. Ammunition reserves dwindled, but there were no targets. Food supplies wore thin, and hunting was near impossible in terrain stripped for defensive construction. Radios fell silent as batteries died. Disease spread through the ranks. Soldiers who had prepared themselves for a glorious last stand now faced something far worse: irrelevance. They weren't being defeated. They were being bypassed. Personal diaries describe officers struggling to explain the situation to their men. Some wrote about seeing American convoys sail peacefully past the beaches they were ordered to defend. Others expressed silent rage, not at the enemy, but at their own leadership for preparing them for a battle that no longer mattered. To them, this was not retreat or surrender. It was suffocation. By war's end, more than 40,000 Japanese soldiers remained stranded on bypassed islands throughout the Pacific. Many died of starvation, disease, and dehydration. Some never fired a single shot. They weren't crushed by American firepower. They decayed behind fortress walls built to protect them. They had prepared to die for the Emperor. Instead, they were left to wither for him. The psychological fallout from the bypass strategy proved more destructive than the naval bombardment. Japan's defensive doctrine was built on the belief that honor was earned through confrontation, that dying in battle, not surviving it, defined a soldier's purpose. But as the Americans advanced past the fortress islands without stepping foot on them, tens of thousands of Japanese troops faced a reality their training had never prepared them for. How do you fight an enemy who simply refuses to acknowledge your existence? Reports from these bypassed garrisons describe days turning into weeks, and weeks into months, with no change in routine. Soldiers remained at guns that never fired. Defensive trenches filled not with blood, but with rainwater. Commanders issued orders to maintain battle readiness, even as supplies dwindled and morale collapsed. One officer reportedly told his men, "We trained to die standing. Now we will die waiting." For many, that waiting was far worse than combat. The isolation ate away at their discipline. With no ammunition to conserve and no orders incoming, units began rationing food so harshly that soldiers traded rifle rounds for bowls of rice. Others abandoned formation drills entirely. On some islands, men continued to practice nighttime combat maneuvers against imaginary attackers, desperately clinging to the purpose combat had promised them. But when they looked to the horizon and saw American ships sailing past without challenge, the truth settled in like a fog. They were no longer defenders. They were forgotten. From Tokyo's perspective, these outposts existed to delay the U.S. advance. But the opposite occurred. The Americans had redefined warfare around maneuver, speed, and targeted strikes, bypassing fixed positions that no longer dictated the course of the fight. What Japan believed would be an immovable wall became a static liability. Their fortresses didn't fall. They were rendered insignificant. For the men stationed there, insignificance was worse than defeat. In their final messages, some wrote that death by combat would have been an honor. Instead, they starved or succumbed to disease, casualties not of battle, but of a broken doctrine. They had prepared to die for the emperor. Instead, they vanished from history's battlefield, not through surrender, but through silence. And the war had already moved on without them. The fall of Kwajalein and the abandonment of the outer strongholds didn't just mark a tactical victory, it signaled the collapse of an entire military philosophy. Until 1944, Japanese strategists believed that fortified positions, once reinforced and backed by unwavering resolve, could hold back any invading force. Their doctrine centered around the decisive battle. Draw the enemy into a brutal, attritional confrontation, and bleed them dry. But the Americans didn't grind forward. They moved past. In doing so, they proved that time, mobility, and strategic precision could be more powerful than guns, bunkers, or manpower. Island hopping wasn't simply a plan. It was the evolution of warfare. Instead of fighting to destroy the enemy's strongest position, the U.S. began targeting critical infrastructure, supply lines, and command hubs. They recognized that isolating an enemy could be more efficient than battling them head-on. Every bypassed fortress became a drain on Japanese logistics, consuming resources and attention while contributing nothing to the war effort. What was once considered strength transformed into vulnerability. The Japanese high command watched in disbelief as their most fortified islands became liabilities. The heavily armed garrisons trapped on strongholds consumed supplies that no longer existed, and yet they couldn't retreat. Each bypassed stronghold became a tomb of concrete and discipline. Meanwhile, the Americans advanced rapidly, focusing on islands with airfields or strategic positioning, effectively leapfrogging through the Pacific. What once required years of meticulous assault planning could now be neutralized with a navigational decision. This shift reshaped military thinking globally. Never again would great powers assume that static defenses alone could guarantee survival. Kwajalein marked a turning point where maneuver warfare proved superior to positional warfare. Later operations at Saipan, Tinian, and finally Iwo Jima reflected this evolution. Choose critical points, isolate the enemy, force them to collapse from within. Japan had prepared for a warrior's last stand. The United States brought a strategist's scalpel. Their fortresses didn't fail because they were weak. They failed because they were immobile in a war that demanded movement. The battlefield had changed, and Japan had not. The fall of Kwajalein was more than a tactical victory. It was a moment where history shifted direction. What collapsed in those 4 days wasn't just a chain of Pacific islands, but an entire centuries-old philosophy of war. Japan entered the conflict believing that honor came from holding ground, that sacrifice could outweigh technology and cunning. They clung to the idea that the strongest position, fortified and defended with commitment, would force their enemy into predictable confrontation. Instead, the Americans proved that the deadliest weapon in war is not firepower, but unpredictability. For centuries, military strategy across cultures revolved around decisive battles fought at chosen strong points. Kwajalein shattered that idea. The U.S. didn't attack strength. They redefined success by bypassing it. In doing so, they forced Japan's fortresses to rot into their own graves. The The strongest islands became the slowest moving assets. The elite troops became stranded liabilities. It wasn't brute force that defeated the Z plan, it was adaptation. Survivor accounts from bypassed islands speak of men who realized too late that they had prepared for the wrong war. Some wrote home that their greatest defeat was not being killed by the enemy, but falling without having the chance to fight them. They had been trained for dramatic last stands, yet met their end in silence, watching ships pass by without firing a round. Their existence was erased not by destruction, but indifference. The Americans didn't just conquer terrain, they weaponized time. Each bypassed island was proof that strategy could defeat courage, and intelligence could outmaneuver tradition. Kwajalein marked the end of the static fortress era and the rise of maneuver warfare, where mobility, vision, and speed became the new battlefield currency. In 4 days, the U.S. invalidated 40 years of Japanese strategic planning and 400 years of samurai-inspired doctrine. The war would continue through Mariana Islands, Leyte Gulf, and ultimately the doorstep of the Japanese homeland. But after Kwajalein, one truth became inescapable. Victory no longer belonged to the army that stood firm. It belonged to the one that refused to stand still. And from that moment forward, the Pacific War would be fought on terms Japan could no longer define. No longer define. No longer define.